The story of the founding of New Prague is quite fascinating, as it begins with a decision to leave Bohemia in Central Europe, capital of which is Prague, or Praha, crossing the Atlantic after leaving from Bremen on the North Sea in Germany, and traveling up to 9 weeks, 10 weeks, 11 weeks across the Atlantic, ending up in either New York, Baltimore, or New Orleans. But the first group that came started out and disembarked at Castle Gardens in the tip of Manhattan, which was an 1840 fort built by the Americans to thwart the British in the War of 1812. After traveling by boat and by carriage and by train, they ended up probably in Chicago and then overland to Dubuque, Iowa, where the families established their homes at the beginning. And because of a smallpox outbreak and lack of employment, and these first Bohemian families decided to claim land in the territory which was Minnesota before it was a state. So they left Dubuque and traveled on riverboat to St. Paul, where the oral story of the founding of New Prague really begins to take shape. Meeting with Bishop Cretin, who was at the Diocese of St. Paul, and who had all knowledge of what was happening in Minnesota and control of it, told them they probably should head north along the Mississippi and meet with the community at St. John's Abbey, where land was available in the surrounding farm and rural area. However, legend says that they decided to take a left turn instead of a right turn and follow the Mississippi. They ended up following the Minnesota River to Shakopee. They were greeted by another priest, a land agent, who told them of Anton Phillip, who had come the same year and earlier in the spring and made a claim, an estate, which ended up being New Prague today. And so this group of men left Shakopee, followed the Traverse des Sioux Trail, which is Highway 169, to Jordan, and hooked up with Sand Creek. Now, whether they ended up in Louisville or ended up in Jordan, it's not known, but they followed a marked trail along the creek because there were no roads. They followed the creek to what ended up as being the Martin Marushka Farm, which is on Highway 15, County Road 15, and where it crosses the County Road 15, they left the creek, the marked trail that Anton Phillip had made by notching trees, I suppose, and bending and breaking twigs. Excuse me. And then they traveled overland to the west. Now, this was no easy task because they were in the big woods, a vast forest of deciduous trees. They were able to hook up with the east tributary of the Raven Stream Creek first, which flows through New Prague. They followed that to the south, and that's where they met Anton Phillip, who was living by himself in a dugout, log and sod and dirt home along that particular creek. The Martin and Albesta Marushka Farm was established in 1868, so it was a very early farmstead. And all the settlers, if they were traveling to Shakopee to have their grain ground into flour or to buy supplies or whatever, they would follow that same Indian trail that Anton Phillip and these first Bohemian families followed. When they hooked up with a tributary of the Raven Stream, all the early families built log homes along that creek. And one of them we visited, and that is the home of Mr. Shimmick, which was built in 1862. That house still retains its core, which was log. And all along that stretch in Avenue, First Avenue Northwest, other families built log houses. Once you cross, which was formerly County Road 37, it's a new it's taken over by the city now, and I do not know the name. But that's where the Minar and Kokesh Brewery was established in 1882. Beer was a mainstay of Bohemian and German culture. There were many Germans living in the area, especially west of New Prague in the Union Hill area, but some of the first merchants in New Prague were Germans from Heidelberg. The brewery became well established, and they were in business until the 1890s when another group bought the brewery and continued the brewing tradition until Prohibition in the early World War I. Not too far from that brewery is where, as I mentioned, was where Anton Philip built his log home. And in that, there were many Native Americans in the area. And when his wife arrived, she was pregnant and she delivered a baby in that log house. And the Native American women in the area were always begging for food, and then they were leaving deer and other wildlife behind as to payment for the bread or the whatever Mrs. Phillip was giving them. Anyway, the Native Americans first nursed one of the Matthias Phillips after his mother became sick after childbirth and bathed him in the creek, which is the creek that meanders through New Prague behind Casey's convenience store. And the Yackley cabin, which was made of log, was built across the creek from the Phillips, and that was convenient because Mrs. Yackley was related to the Phillips family. Eventually, Anton Philip built other homes. The first few were log, and his first brick house, made out of 18-inch logs made by Mr. Makishka, a brickmaker in New Prague, was built along the tracks of the railroad and across from the train depot. Of course, the train depot did not come until 1877, so they kind of corresponded, but the first bricks were made from clay on that particular site. Next door was the Tom Mix Hotel, the railroad house, which was eventually moved across Main Street, became the Mommer and Deutsch hardware store, and next door was Mrs. Pani, whose father owned the Mertz and Renner general store across the street on Main Street. After leaving that particular commercial area and crossing the Raven Stream tributary at the corner of Main Street and Highway 21 that goes to Jordan, there are three interesting sites. One is the Soda and Cider Works that was built and run by Mr. Lukash. And Mr. Lukash brewed his root beer and the soda in the basement along with fermenting cider, and they were distributed from the basement in bottles around about 1895, 1900 in that vicinity. Next door was the Tom Kubish Livery, and the Tom Kubish Livery served the community, primarily salesmen who got off the train. But they needed transportation to the surrounding communities like Besley, St. Benedict, and Union Hill, and Heidelberg, and they needed transportation. So he would rent his horses and buggies to the traveling salesmen. The horses and the buggies were kept in the basement. The horses were hitched up to the buggies, parked behind the livery by the creek. They were brought up to the main floor on a ramp that was lowered, and then the horses dragged and brought the carriage up for the salesman or whoever was renting the carriage for the day. And then they exited in the front through big double doors that faced Main Street. Next to the livery stable was the beginning of the New Prague milling industry in New Prague. Remember, New Prague was known as the bread and butter city. And the first owners of the mill was Succomill and Bezick. It was a grist mill, and they used stones to grind the flour. Eventually they used steam, and it became the Simmer Eclipse flour mill, and then the Bean and Mallory flour mill. Excuse me. Before moving across the railroad tracks and established the mill where it presently is today. The mill burned in 1895, so there are no remnants left of it. Later, the mill became powered by steam, and it led to New Prague's reputation as a center for milling in southern Minnesota.